Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, Mikki here. You are listening to Mikkipedia, and this week on the podcast I speak to Andrew, or Drew, Best about the limit of human energy expenditure. Now this is related to, or a carry-on if you like, from my Herman Pontzer interview that we did back on episode 51, and I believe that was October 2021. Drew is currently a PhD student of Pontzer's, and he is studying the limit of human performance, or rather energy expenditure, in a group of elite level endurance runners and cyclists to determine whether the theoretical ceiling of 2.5 times our basal metabolic rate holds for these outlying individuals. In our discussion, we talk about how basal metabolic rate is measured, if we can shift our BMR, how to measure total energy expenditure, and why a high total energy expenditure is risky from an evolutionary standpoint, because Andrew is a biological anthropologist, so this is a particular interest of his. We also discuss the contribution of non-exercise activity thermogenesis and how this may change when we ramp up activity, and specifically what Drew is finding in his study of the elite athletes and what contributions that he is making to the literature base in this space. I think you're going to really like this interview regardless of whether or not you're an athlete. As a teacher, Drew really is able to share his knowledge in a really translatable way, so that's really cool. So Andrew Best is a biological anthropologist and assistant professor of biology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. He's also a respectable endurance athlete in his own right. Drew is currently conducting, as I said, his research project on ultramarathon and ultra-endurance athletes and looking at testing the limits of a human metabolic scope. And we've got links to where you can find Drew over on the show notes, be it his website, therunningprimate.com, Instagram at the same handle, and at runningprimate on Twitter. And we've also got his Strava handle there just for you Strava guys. All right, team, before we crack on into the episode, I would like to remind you that the best way to support the podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening platform. That increases the visibility of the podcast out there in amongst the literally thousands of other podcasts, so more people get the opportunity to learn from guests that I have on the show, such as Assistant Professor Best. All right, enjoy this conversation. Drew, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me this morning about your research and your knowledge in and around the limits of human performance. And I got to say, this whole area confuses me no end, but I constantly go round and round in my head as to how these concepts exist in particularly the endurance space, which is the space that I'm in, and of course the space that you're researching, and just I don't know, trying to put together in my head what I see in clinical practice, but also what we see in research and stuff. So I'm hoping that you're going to at least help unveil some of these things for me this morning.
Oh, we'll see.
So I've actually spoken to Herman Pontzer on a podcast before when his book Burn came out, which was super interesting when, of course, he was discussing just the differences in energy expenditure between the sort of more traditional populations versus your sort of standard American lifestyle actually not being that different, which doesn't really make sense to a lot of people as to how that could even be true until, of course, you start thinking about the energy conservation sort of theory and what goes on in the body when we are super active. Firstly, though, before we get into the nuts and bolts of that energy expenditure, What is your background? How did you actually get interested in the area? Because I understand you're sort of not a late bloomer as such, but you've done things not conventionally speaking to the usual timeline.
I think saying that I'm a late bloomer is totally fair. I mean, I'm 40 and I'm only in year 2 of my first academic job as a faculty member. So, I'm a late bloomer.
Yeah.
So the long story short, I taught high school biology for 15 years, mostly here in Massachusetts, USA. And partway through that, I was developing a lesson on human evolution, or actually a whole unit. And through that process, I discovered it's a paper you might be familiar with, and if you're not, you'll love it. A 2004 paper by Dennis Bramble and Dan Lieberman called Endurance Running and the Evolution of Homo. So it laid out the whole hypothesis that, hey, actually lots of the attributes that we see in modern humans can be explained by a period of selection for endurance running. So we've evolved to run, right? And that was very compelling to me because I'm a runner, and even more so then. And I've always been into human evolution and the idea that, we are evolved animals, and what does that mean? So that really lit the fire. And I went back to school for a master's and PhD in biological anthropology. And my research so far has been on sweating, the evolution of sweating, what's the variation in how many sweat glands people have, stuff like that, which we talk about if it's interesting.
You're not particularly interested in that anymore, are you?
It's on pause, but mostly because I only have time to do one project at a time, because I'm teaching so much. So I'm at a school that does a lot of teaching, and so the research is, you kind of squeeze it in where you can. I read a lot of Herman Pontzer's papers. He was one of the handful of scientists that really sort of spoke to my interests. And so at some point, I think I emailed him or maybe messaged him on Twitter and asked him some questions. And it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that an ultra marathon runner, Joe McConaughey, who I'd met at a race, reached out to me and said, hey, I would like to get some data on this Arizona trail effort that I'm doing. And he ended up setting the FKT on the Arizona trail. And he said, do you know what kind of data we can get? And can you do this? And I said, at the moment, I don't, but I know some people who can help us, and this will be a great learning curve. So that was the beginning of it. And we got total energy expenditure data on Joe during that effort and during a period of training. And that was kind of a proof of concept where Herman and I basically saw, hey, we can get really useful data doing this, and this will let us test some of Herman's ideas in a way that hasn't really been done before. So here we are.
And in particular, what sort of hypothesis or, what are you actually testing with the likes of the data from that athlete and, of course, subsequently in your research sort of moving forward?
Yeah, so I guess the simpler data that we're getting is just to better define the relationship between how long you're doing a maximal effort and the energy expenditure that's required of that effort, right? And so we're finding that there is a logarithmic relationship between how far you're going and how many calories you can spend doing that at a maximal effort, which isn't really all that surprising. And I mean, in some ways, that's just an extension of, you can only use this much oxygen if you're, running a marathon. But if you're running a shorter distance, you can afford, to go on oxygen debt. It's kind of an extension of that concept. So we're doing that too. But primarily, we're testing what we're calling the 2.5 times BMR hypothesis, which Herman may have talked about with you. I haven't had a chance to listen to your episode.
Oh, please remind us, because I talk to so many people, I've forgotten almost everything.
Okay, sure, fair enough. So a couple years ago, Herman and one of his grad students and some other researchers published a paper getting total energy expenditure data. I can redefine that later on folks running across the U.S. So it was a stage race. They're running across the U.S., basically a marathon a day for, I think it was 6 weeks or something. And as part of that, he also reanalyzed some data that had been presented maybe first by Westerterp, a researcher, sort of the early 2000s, who had actually suggested, hey, look, there seems to be a common limit to basically how much energy a person can expend over the long haul. So we're calling this sustained metabolic scope. So your metabolic scope would be your basal metabolic rate, so the calories it takes just to keep you alive, plus all the other things that you're spending energy on. So we would call that total energy expenditure. And metabolic scope is just a measure of what is your total energy expenditure divided by your basal metabolic rate. So how many times over and above your basal metabolic rate are you living at?
And is that the 2.5 that you mentioned?
Right. So Westerterp and then Pontzer have been noticing that the limit seems to be about 2.5 roughly times basal metabolic rate. And that seems to be common, basically not just to runners, in their training over the course of months or a year, but also cyclists. You can see it really any kind of endurance athlete, but then crucially, any person who is living a really high energy lifestyle, whether that be really intensive farming. So, maybe during certain seasons of the year, it's very intensive. Those people also seem to be getting close to, but not exceeding 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. So this seems to be a limit that is intrinsic to human physiology and not just something related to athletic performance. So, which has led Pontzer and others to say this is probably a limit set by your digestion.
How many calories you can eat?
How many calories you can actually extract from your food and then assimilate and store as glycogen, as usable triglycerides, etc. So that's really what we're testing. We want to know, what are the limits to human energy expenditure? Is it around 2.5? We're thinking it might be a little bit more, so really the population we're working with is ultra marathon runners, expanding out a little bit to other types of ultra endurance athletes, maybe some cyclists, but people who sort of form a natural experimental group, folks who have, nutrition dialed in. Many of them are professionals, or at least they're really able to prioritize training and recovery. And, because we're modern humans, we have access to unlimited calories. So we're not suggesting that this is how early humans ever lived.
No,
right?
no.
But we're saying that this is almost a natural experiment with these people to see what are the limits of human energy expenditure when these other factors that would normally come into play have sort of been controlled.
Okay. And even though this group they're almost outliers of the general population, this is one of the reasons why you're interested in studying them.
Absolutely. And as an anthropologist, I would be remiss if I didn't, at least try to explain that when you're working with a population that are outliers, you need to understand they're not representative of all humans. But in this case, the way that they're outliers makes them perfect for testing these questions.
Yeah, for sure. So, Drew, I've got heaps of questions that arise just even from that and the whole idea of that sort of energy extraction. I start thinking about things like the gut and start thinking about the thrifty gene hypothesis and all of the things that come into how energy is sort of taken on board and also used. But can we actually start with energy expenditure? So obviously you mentioned BMR, basal metabolic rate, and then these other things which then sort of determine our overall energy expenditure. So my first question is, how reliable are those calculators that you find online for determining your metabolic rate? So that's my first question, and then I'll go on to getting you to define energy expenditure in those little buckets.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about estimating your basal metabolic rate, which is a much easier thing to estimate.
Yes.
Some of the calculators are okay. I've used a couple.
Okay. That's
yeah. I would say probably most of them are okay. The ones that are better. So Pontzer actually just recently came up with an updated equation that seems to be the best yet.
Oh, amazing. Is that available?
Yes, it's in one of his papers, but I could send it to you if you're interested. I have it somewhere.
I can PubMed it easily enough, so that's all good. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
We'll do that. So someone really should be making an online calculator based on that.
Yes.
But any of the more recent ones. There's been a bunch of studies that have taken basal metabolic rate measured through the gold standard, which would be calorimetry, basically putting on the mask and measuring oxygen consumption for 20 to 30 minutes, or even better, have someone living in a metabolic chamber for 24 hours doing nothing, really calculate it. So there have been studies that basically get those data, and then from that you can sort of extrapolate what a usable equation is to estimate basal metabolic rate. So the short answer would be that they're okay. You might get within 100 or 200 calories of what your BMR actually is using one of those calculators. But as soon as you try to estimate, and I've seen calculators that do this, what is your total energy expenditure? And then they try to factor in activity level, things like that. And then it's just a total crapshoot.
What's sort of like what you see when you use your Garmin watch and you go out for a run and then you come back and it says, well, that was 996 calories that you just burnt during that run. Is that slightly more accurate than what I might find on the internet, or is it actually as variable in terms of its accuracy?
That's a good question. I'm sure that someone has actually looked at this and published on it, and I have not read it, so I will not claim expertise here. But I would imagine those are at least a little better, because at least it knows how far you went, what your elevation gain was, and those are really so the things that are going to mostly explain how much energy you're using at rest would be your fat-free mass. So that's why a BMR calculator is fairly accurate, because if it knows how much you weigh, and especially if you know your body fat percentage, so that you can tell it what your fat-free mass is, the BMR estimates are okay. If you're looking at an estimate of your activity energy expenditure, you can get maybe a reasonable estimate if you know how far you went and how much you weigh, right? Because the cost of running is not highly variable it's not super variable between people, as long as you know body mass, right? So after you account for body mass, that sort of explains most of the variation.
Yeah, cool.
Which, as you know, does not change all that much whether you're running faster or slower.
Isn't that interesting? Like when you feel like when you're out on a run and you're sort of doing intervals, you're doing that we've got park run here. I don't know does America have park run?
Park run?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, this is massive. Like it was originated in the UK. It's been around for maybe 10 years now. And it's this phenomenal free 5K event that people can go along to, and they turn up with their little chip, and it's like running a race, a 5K race, but it's got everything that you want in a race and all the stuff that you don't. Anyway, but you feel like when you run like a super fast 5K versus you just jogging around the course, that you're actually going to be burning more calories because of it. But is that actually not the case?
Right. So you're burning more calories per unit time, but not per unit distance, right? So you run 3 miles easy, you might burn 400 calories if you're an average weight person.
Yeah.
If you run it hard, you might burn 400 calories. But because you're condensing that same energy expenditure into a shorter period of time,
yeah.
To do that, you're now really requiring your muscle fibers to generate ATP anaerobically, and that leads to all of the unpleasant symptoms of, well, now you're going to be diverting more blood flow away from your intestines and to the muscles, and so you're going to have gastrointestinal distress, and your blood pH is dropping a bit, and you're feeling that anaerobic panic.
Yes.
But yeah, roughly the same number of calories, though.
Oh, mate. I mean, that's really good intel. Anyway, so
it's just reason to slow down,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, and enjoy it. God, get the most out of your run. Okay, so obviously we've got the energy we've got the activity, but where else in that sort of energy energy expenditure model, where else do we sort of expend calories?
Yeah, okay, so you've got your basal metabolic rate, you've got your activity energy expenditure, which some people would parse into exercise and non-exercise activity. So walking around the office, the example I use in class is, I'm writing on the board. This isn't taking very much energy, but it does count as physical activity expenditure. I just lump them together. Any physical activity, that's one category. Basal metabolic rate's another. Another big one would be the cost of digestion, which does take calories. So we call the thermic effect of food, just because, it is like producing heat as a byproduct of that energy expenditure. And the other one, which is only really a factor if you're in a fairly cold environment, or you just keep the heat down in your house really low, would be thermal regulation. So to stay warm, that can cost some calories. I think if you're in a really cold climate, like you're, camping outdoors in the winter, that can be a couple hundred calories a day.
Yeah, okay.
But in most environments, it would be fairly negligible.
Okay. So Drew, I mean, it's fairly obvious just talking to you, where the variation comes in terms of our overall energy expenditure. But what about in these seemingly sort of fixed areas, like basal metabolic rate? Feels to me like it would be fairly fixed. And even actually, this was a surprise to me, is that the amount of fat-free mass that you accrue doesn't necessarily boost your metabolism by hundreds of calories every day when you start to build lean mass. How changeable is our BMR? Like, can we manipulate it to burn more calories easily?
Great question. And I gave this a little bit of thought this morning before we spoke, and I took some notes here just so I would remember what I wanted to say. So, okay, can you increase your BMR over time? I know this is not what you're asking,
I sort of am, actually.
Well, what I'm about to say is not directly answering your question. I would like to start by just saying, why would you want to? Right?
Yes. To eat
I know
more.
some obesity researchers are interested in that. I mean, it's a potential, I don't want to say silver bullet, but it's maybe a tiny silver bullet for the obesity epidemic. Is if we can find a way to get people to crank up their BMR, then yeah, you're just burning more calories at rest. You're going to accrue less fat tissue, et cetera, and that really could be a good thing. But I'm not an obesity researcher, but it seems to me that putting the focus on increasing your BMR is not nearly as useful and won't bear as much fruit as the things that we already know you can do, which would be increasing physical activity expenditure and reducing calorie intake.
Yeah.
And I think we've largely failed, though, at convincing people that we need to do those things.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is maybe why we're talking about, can you increase BMR? So that said, can you increase BMR? You already pointed out one of the ways, and that would be to add muscle mass. And other than that, and I have not read all the literature on this.
Oh, good.
But I am not really aware of any other ways to really increase BMR other than like stimulant drugs and like metabolic drugs that are used for obesity and things like that. But I think there's some decent evidence that you can avoid reducing your BMR by eating enough. I don't want to oversimplify this and sound kind of pseudoscience-y, but if you're eating less than you need, then your body's response is to metabolically compensate more. And so you're slowing down your metabolism. It's almost like you're clicking your body over into that starvation mode, which I believe will slow down your BMR a bit. So if that's not something you want to do, I mean, this is very anecdotal, but the concept of skinny fat, and some athletes definitely experience this, but certainly non-athletes, that you can be a very lean looking person, but if you're not eating a lot of calories and you're not getting a lot of activity, you might have more adipose tissue than you think and less muscle mass than you think. So ways to increase BMR. Well, first of all, eat enough, right? Don't make your body think that it needs to hang on to everything. And I guess the other one, I'm sure we'll get into this, but so we're seeing from Pontzer's work that BMR, well, we think it's BMR, tends to reduce a bit as you become physically active. But crucially, that's sort of a long-term thing. But if you take a snapshot in the hours to even 24 hours after a workout, your BMR is elevated, right? So
interesting. So is that different from the concept of EPOC exercise?
That is EPOC.
It is okay, yeah, because I've seen varying sort of reports on how much this might impact BMR, in any sort of meaningful way. But are we thinking that? So the last that I had been, look, I'm not up to the play with the science, but the last I had heard is that actually doesn't make that much difference. But in fact, do we think that it may play a bigger role than I might be giving it credit for?
I don't know. I mean, I guess. The fact that we're seeing metabolic compensation, which I guess we haven't yet defined, in people who are very active, tells us that that the bump in BMR from EPOC, which is transient, is not enough to actually overcome the overall reduction in BMR that you get. So when I measure BMR in the lab, I want people to have not done any exercise for 12 hours, and they can't have done a hard workout the day before, because I don't want that EPOC, which is really that's just your body recovering from the last workout. I don't want that to mask or, to artificially inflate BMR. So I think that was a long-winded answer. Is EPOC going to contribute meaningfully to an increase in BMR in a way that could be helpful for weight loss? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Drew, you mentioned metabolic compensation, and I have a number of clients who report to me, and because as a nutritionist who is an endurance athlete, a lot of the people I see are also endurance athletes, and they are struggling with improving their body composition, yet seem to be eating very little. So, and then they might be on 1,800, 2,000 calories, yet burning sort of, an additional, 700 or 800 calories on top of that, yet not seeing changes in their body composition. So is the metabolic compensation concept the thing that might be occurring in that setting?
I think that is what Pontzer's data would suggest.
Yeah.
And I believe so, yeah. So I guess we should probably start by defining what we mean by this metabolic compensation, right? So this is so Herman Pontzer has termed this constrained energy expenditure, right? Where so let's say you increase your activity and energy expenditure by 1,000 calories a day. So you start running 9 miles a day or something, more than you used to. The old model would basically predict that your total energy expenditure is going to be 1,000 calories higher than it was before, because you're adding 1,000 calories worth of activity expenditure. Metabolic compensation is basically saying, well, over weeks and months and years, your body gets used to those 1,000 calories that you're burning, and your body finds ways of reducing energy expenditure elsewhere. And there's some preliminary evidence that some of that's coming out of BMR. So maybe reduced investment in sex hormones, reduced investment in immune system energy expenditure. And some of it's probably coming from things like fidgeting and voluntary activity. All right. So after a run, what do? You flop, and you stay flopped as long as you can. So in all those ways, you're reducing energy expenditure somewhere else. And some of the data that have come out so far are showing it can be 20 to 30%. What that would translate to is, if your clients are expecting that they're burning an extra 1,000 calories a day, because that's what they're burning with exercise, 20 to 30% means they might only be burning 700 to 800 extra calories a day.
Yeah.
So that's something that gets lost in the mix and in the headlines that you see based on this work. There have been headlines like exercise does not work for weight loss, exercise is of time for weight loss. And I think that's overstating the point, because you're still going to be burning 700 or 800 calories more total, just not 1,000. So there are limits to how much your body can metabolically compensate. And I can tell you that, we've measured some endurance runners who are burning 4,500 calories a day on average year round. So it's totally possible. You just have to do a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And are they also eating 4,500 calories to remain in energy balance?
They must be. We have not asked them to track nutrition, but, basic laws of physics are telling us that, yeah, they must be, because they're not dramatically changing weight. So, yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. And Drew, with regards to again, if I just go back to that basal metabolic rate, and in fact, I remember what I was going to ask you, do different dietary patterns, can that increase basal metabolic rate? So, I've seen sort of research looking at whether a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, does it change the number of calories we burn on a daily basis? Like, what is the understanding there? Do you know?
That's a great question. I looked into this a little bit for a class that I'm teaching.
It's the best thing about teaching. You learn so much.
Seriously, it's great. it's time that I have to devote to these interesting questions that I otherwise would. And with that being said, I don't think I have a great answer to that. My impression from looking at some of the meta studies and stuff is that all the hype about various kinds of diets actually changing your BMR in a way that's meaningful for weight loss, which is what most people care about. I think there's probably not very good evidence for that. We do know that low carb diets can be a very useful weight loss tool, especially initially. I'm not aware of data though that like definitively show that that's increasing BMR so much as mobilizing fat tissue for for burning, for metabolism. And I think that those diets mostly work also because they tend to put you in a negative energy balance. So what I think you're a nutritionist, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what all successful weight loss diets seem to have in common is that you're actually eating less than you were before.
100%. Yeah.
So calories in, calories out. People like to say, no, that's wrong. We have a new model. It still seems to mostly, it's like calories in, calories out. It's a little more complicated than that, but not much.
Yeah. No, 100%. That's as I understand it as well. And with the participants in your study, and I'd really love to actually chat about the information that you are gathering, but do you know how they're eating and whether they have different dietary patterns, which may also sort of play into that energy expenditure sort of piece?
That's a great question. We haven't really gotten there. Only with one of I know anecdotally that, these athletes have varying diets. One of them is vegan, and some others have a really varied diet. I know one guy is very carbohydrate heavy. But as far as actually getting those data, we only have them from one of the athletes so far because and that's Joe McConaughey. I can say his name. He's like so on board with this. He doesn't care if we identify him. He's a great guinea pig. No offense, Joe. I mean, that is a compliment. And so his wife, Katie, is actually training as a nutritionist. And so she has been getting some of his nutrition data. And so we have a good sense of what he eats during ultramarathon competitions and also baseline. But I think to be able to, any of the differences in total energy expenditure that could possibly be caused by diet, I think the effect size would be so small because, as we've been saying, it really is mostly calories in, calories out. And then the fine tuning other than that is, I think minimal. We would need a huge sample size of athletes that I don't think we're ever going to get. So I don't think our data will ever really be able to help answer the question, does the composition of your diet actually affect your total energy expenditure?
Yeah, no, it's a super interesting concept. And I was chatting to an exercise physiologist friend who is largely a lower carbohydrate. He does huge volumes of exercise, and he's up there in the sort of more the sort of sub-elite. Doesn't sound like a great category to be in, but he is one of the people who'd be perfect for a study like yours, for example. And we were just having that conversation about his diet and how it might, impact on what you might see with someone like him. And in fact, he gave me his details to pass on to you just in case you were looking for people.
Please do.
Okay, good. Yeah. So Andrew, obviously our body compensates for a reason. And, there is that threshold of potentially 2.5, which you are thinking with these outliers could actually be a little bit higher. Why is high energy expenditure so risky for us as humans?
Yeah, so it's great. I love the anthropological questions and the evolutionary questions because that, in theory, is what we're really getting at, right? Which is funny because most of what we talk about with this project is what are the applications going to be for athletes? I'm not sure yet, but we do know that an application in terms of evolutionary understanding. So it's really no longer risky for most of us because if you live in the developed world, you have probably too many calories. I'm a mountain biker. I'm kind of a runner, but mostly I'm a mountain biker now. And right now, I'm very often training to the point of depletion. And where I have a couple days where I know that my glycogen's gone. And I don't have to worry about that because I can eat all the food I want.
Yeah.
And it's still limiting. It still takes a couple days, to rebuild, those energy stores. But it used to be risky, certainly, And it would be risky for any animal that's living out there in the world. Or if you're a hunter-gatherer right now, actually living off the land, it is still risky just because we burn a lot of calories. We are the primates who kind of went in the other direction. And instead of decreasing our energy expenditure, we are we're a high burning primate. So the risk is you don't have enough energy and you start to starve. So this is probably why, and this is true for all animals, right? I mean, every mammal has mechanisms to conserve energy, like mobilizing more fat for fuel, all those kinds of things. I wouldn't be surprised if most mammals actually reduce their BMR in response to higher activity or reduced calorie intake, just like we do. That's probably true. But certainly relative to other primates, humans, it seems like underwent a period of evolutionary pressures to make us even more austere in terms of energy savings. And sort of putting together the work of others to kind of summarize where we fit or what our energetic characteristics are. Would you like the 30-second rundown of how we think this evolved?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So basically primates, it'll actually be about a minute and a half, not 30 seconds.
That's fine.
So we are primates. Primates in general have a slower metabolic rate versus other mammals. And they're not very physically active generally. So they mostly get all the food they need in their immediate area. They do some climbing, whatever, but they're not, they don't travel long distances. Humans, we have a really high metabolic rate. So a higher total energy expenditure than other primates. And yet we also are physically active, very, physically active. We have a high reproductive output. Yet we have a slow childhood. We have a long life and big brains. To an anthropologist, that's weird. I mean, for most animals, all those things wouldn't really go together. You'd have to make trade-offs. And we really didn't. We have big brains, long childhood, we live a long time, and yet we have a high total energy expenditure. So how did we do this? How did we solve this problem, without having too many trade-offs? So probably about 2 million years ago, around there, early in genus Homo, we developed a new ecological niche, a new way of extracting energy from the environment. And that was to basically spend more energy getting food, but get higher quality food. So it's not so much that we're efficient with our foraging, it's that sort of high risk, high reward. And that's how hunter-gatherers still do it. They'll walk 5 to 10 miles a day. And, there's digging and all this. But the food we're able to get is of a higher nutrient density than what other primates get. And that includes meat, that includes tubers, whatever. So this new strategy probably pushed the evolution of our endurance capabilities, right? So you can only be this high energy, big brained, high reproductive output primate if you have a way of getting all those calories. And for us, that was, covering longer distances to find all kinds of different food stuff. So that's where our endurance comes from, running, walking, whatever. But there's actually 2 others. We also are fatter. We are fatter than other primates. So, to some people, it kind of sounds like a contradiction. We are the running primate, right, if you will, but we're also the fat primate. And those actually go together really well. If you're going to be a high energy expenditure primate, you need to have more of a buffer for the times when you can't find enough food. And so that's why we're fatter than other primates. And I think the other piece that evolved, which is what we've been talking about, is that our metabolic rate has evolved to be sensitive to our physical activity level and how much food we're getting, right? And there's even evidence that, this even goes kind of back generations, right? Like the maternal food environment seems to be having an effect on the future metabolism of the fetus, almost like the fetus is predicting what the external environment will be. And this goes a step further too. Not only is our metabolism finely tunable for how much activity we're doing and how much we're eating, but our exercise capacities are too, right? So the reason why you're not just fit all the time is that it takes energy to invest in greater bone density, greater muscle mass, more mitochondria, increased left ventricle thickness, whatever, making more red blood cells, all the things that make you fit as an athlete take energy. And so instead of evolving to always be fit, we've evolved this highly sensitive plasticity where, during times of high activity, our bodies respond to it and get fitter, and they invest in those features that let us do that. But during lean times and times when we're not as active, it stops investing in those resources. And we call that detraining now. So that was the several minute tour of, how our metabolism seems to have evolved and what that has to do with physical activity and calories in the environment.
Yeah, no, that's great, Drew. And what about the thrifty gene hypothesis? Does this play a role in anything that you've just sort of described? Is the prevalence or the number of people that might sort of fit into that category so few that it doesn't really relate to the wider understanding of energy expenditure?
Yeah, so I have to refresh my memory on the thrifty gene hypothesis. I think that's sort of a specific, it's saying there are certain populations of people that have,
yes,
right,
that extract more calories from food than you would otherwise get because of the periods of lean in their history. Right. I believe, like I think.
I believe that's it too. I don't know where the current evidence stands on that or what the current consensus is on that. I mean, I would say all of us have thrifty genes, just as we've been describing, but what the variation is across populations, I'm not sure. I know that has been invoked to try to explain increased rates of obesity and diabetes in certain populations. I'm not sure where we stand on that, so I won't comment on it.
No, that's absolutely fine. And as I understand it, it is it's not something that could be a predominant. It doesn't explain a lot of the obesity at all, like maybe a slither of the obesity sort of epidemic and things. Andrew, what about gut function? Obviously, it appears that people who, and from listening to you on another podcast, you talk about how, in fact, success almost relies on your ability to digest and absorb the calories you're taking in, because then you'll be able to utilize them for energy. Like, what role do you think the gut plays in our sort of overall ability to sort of push through that ceiling of our metabolic limit?
It seems like it probably sets the ultimate ceiling, right? So, if you've sort of maximized, or should I say optimized, all your other systems that are involved in energy expenditure. So if we're talking about endurance sports, if you've trained, if you have a really huge capacity to store glycogen, if you have a high maximal fat oxidation rate in your mitochondria, et cetera, if your tendons and ligaments are strong enough to run for 100 miles, if you've done that stuff, then the ultimate ceiling is probably your absorptive capacity in your intestines. But how much variation there is between people, I don't know, and I don't think it's well understood. So there's a whole other area of research, and if anyone's listening and is like, oh, I know there's papers out there on this, I would love to see them. I don't know what the variation is in that. I mean, certainly that's partly trainable, right? So within one person, like ultra athletes train their gut. They train to tolerate and be able to actually absorb food while they're running, which is not really something your intestines want to do. They want to be shunting blood to your muscles instead. So it's trainable, but what is the variation between people? I don't know. Could that be one of the factors that explains ultra marathon performance? Are the best ultra runners those who have the best intestines? I mean, all other things being equal, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. So, Drew, what is your research? So can you, and I know I leave it to like the last 10 minutes to ask you about your research particularly, but how is your research helping us sort of get a better understanding of this area? What are some interesting things that what are you studying in your 30-second elevator pitch, if there is such a thing? And what are you finding? Are you able to share any of that yet?
Yeah. So we've got a paper in progress just based on the first 6 people that we've studied, but I don't mind talking about it.
Cool. Yeah.
So basically we have measured total energy expenditure so far in 6 ultramarathon runners, both during a period of life and training, so a baseline period, and during a multi-day ultramarathon event. Those 2 numbers let us basically generate a regression equation that tells us roughly how many calories a person is burning. These people are burning in relation to how many miles they're running. So we use that, and we look at their training logs, which are mostly on Strava. And if they're not, I ask them to send them to me. And generate.
That's very accurate, actually, isn't it?
Well, I tell them it has to be accurate. I say, send me whatever is complete. If it's not complete, it's not worth doing.
Oh, but if it doesn't go on Strava, is it even worth talking? Like,
seriously,
did it even happen?
I mean, I love Strava. I am fully committed to doing this Strava. Strava, if you want to sponsor me, give me money for my research. I will gladly shill for you anytime.
Brilliant.
Anyway, and I'm basically plugging their training numbers into this equation and estimating what their monthly and yearly calorie burn is. And with an estimated or a directly measured BMR, we get their metabolic scope. And so we're able to say, so far, the people we've looked at are living over the course of a year consistently at 2.2 to 2.6 times BMR.
Oh, amazing.
And so these are people who are really dedicating most of their lives to burning energy. And so the fact that they're not getting much above 2.5 is so far further evidence that there is this ceiling. But to keep testing this question, we're going to recruit another 10, maybe 20 more ultra endurance athletes and keep doing this. And I'm really aiming for some crazy high volume people now.
Yeah, cool. What is crazy high volume? Because I actually have a number, like there. I know people will be listening to this who will be like, I wonder if I fall into that crazy high volume category.
I mean, if you live close enough to the East Coast of the U.S. that you can ship frozen urine samples to us without them thawing, we're interested if you're training 20 to 30 hours a week.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a significant sort of chunk of time. And so are there any sort of explanatory things coming out which might explain the person who's at 2.2 versus 2.6?
No, which is really exciting.
Okay.
Nothing explains it yet, including how much they're running. I mean, interesting. I mean, the guy at 2.2 is running more than some of the people at 2.4 and 2.5.
Is he better at conserving energy then to allow him to run greater distances?
This is where it gets interesting. And this is where I'm hoping if we talk again in a year or two, there's some interesting stuff. I've been thinking about we're already seeing variation basically in how much physical work people can do at a certain metabolic scope, which I wasn't really expecting. And what that tells us is that there's got to be variation coming from somewhere. And so some possibilities, we're talking about runners right now. So could it be that some of these runners are just that much more economical, that they're burning fewer calories per mile, and therefore they can run more miles within that roughly 2.5 limit? I don't think that's likely. We know that the variation in cost of running between people is not significant enough to explain the variation we're seeing. Some more likely explanations, maybe some of these athletes compensate more than others, metabolically compensate more than others. So if your basal metabolic rate slows down more than that 20 to 30% that we've seen, maybe that is the key to being able to train a lot and being a great ultra athlete. So, maybe the key to a really high energy expenditure is that you can reduce your BMR, you can metabolically compensate more than other people. There's got to be variation in that. I mean, it's a physiological trait. It's a complex one, related to thyroid hormones and whatever else, but it's a physiological trait. There's variation, and we know so little about that variation.
Well, it's interesting on that note, if you think about overtraining and think about going into low energy availability and that whole area. But I do know there are athletes who are really robust with regards to sex hormones and their ability to recover, yet they seem to do such, they seem to put out a lot of energy. So yeah, I agree. There must be some variation there.
Yeah. So that's one thing we really want to look at. And I'm already scheming the ways that we could, try to test that just by measuring BMR and how it changes over different training cycles, et cetera. So hopefully that's
would you run blood panels or get your athletes to run blood panels at the same time to sort of see where their sort of hormone levels might be at any given sort of time in their training cycle?
Yeah, I mean, we would definitely want to see where that energy savings is coming from. And so some markers of that, we could look at markers of the immune system and measures of inflammation. And if those are going down, we could say, all right, they are pulling back energy from immune function, which might not be bad, and it might be, really depending how much they're pulling back, right? Maybe they could be reducing sex hormone levels, which most athletes do, especially endurance athletes, which, in light of these data and, Pontzer's data, now I think we should be considering reduced testosterone and other sex hormone levels in athletes as evidence of metabolic compensation. So yeah, sure. I do think we'd want to be doing blood panels.
Yeah. And Drew, do you have any data on women, on females, and how?
Great question. We have six athletes right now analyzed, one woman.
Okay, interesting.
So that is a goal moving forward.
Oh, for sure. Because it'd be super interesting to understand whether or not the same, is that metabolic scope, is the ceiling a little bit lower? Is it higher? Right. What it might take to sort of, I don't know, push that and what it looks like over a course of, over a group of females as opposed to just one, but an interesting case study nonetheless.
Yeah. And so when we only have a sample size of one female right now, that basically is a case study. And so we need to get way more of these data so that we can, the thing with this project is it really raises a lot more questions than it answers.
Which is great, right?
Which is great. I mean, it means there's a lot of work to do. There's some grants to write, and there's not a lot of people doing this stuff. So there's space to learn things and to do some work, which is great.
Now, I mentioned in my email I sent to you a couple of days ago, and I'm not sure whether you know much about what they're doing, but the Norwegian athletes, the triathletes who seem to be using a similar sort of modality to figure out how much they can train on any given week, given the number of calories that they can actually sort of take in. Is this that sort of application of the work that you're doing? Is this how you sort of see it being applied in that athletic context?
Yeah, embarrassingly, I am not familiar with what they're doing. And actually, if you remember, would you maybe send it to me?
Oh, absolutely. It is Gustav Eden and Christian Blumenfeld. Have you heard of those names before, Drew?
No, but I'm not really plugged into the triathlon.
No, it's all good. So the Norwegians, so both of them, they're part of the same team and they're under a coach. Do you listen to Rich Roll podcast?
Once in a while.
Yeah, okay. So he has had both of them on, plus the coach, and they use exactly this method to sort of determine a training load that they do in any given week. So if they've pushed beyond the limit of what they know so they've used doubly labeled water to measure their energy expenditure, and they've calculated how many calories that they can actually feasibly take on board, and they use it to determine their training loads week to week. I'm giving a very rough sort of description of what he actually does, but super interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like they are ahead of the curve. This is something that Herman and I, and actually Joe McConaughey, have talked about, maybe developing. But it sounds like, in the future when we really understand all this stuff, but it seems like they're not waiting for all that. They're just doing it, which is cool. That's what
athletes do, right? That's what athletes and coaches do. So often there are
athletes and coaches are on the bleeding edge, and they figure out stuff that then the scientists validate later or don't. Half of what they do, like ice baths, probably not good. Yeah. But for how many decades were we told to need to ice everything? And then you actually look back at the science of it, and you're like, why would we ever think that was good?
I know, yeah, but, feels good.
But no, totally, they're on the cutting edge, and this sounds really cool. And I look forward to actually seeing what they're doing.
And you should actually reach out to them, Drew, and just look, hey, you've got hours and hours of teaching and writing and all the rest of it that you've got sort of to do, but it's but hey, if you ever got a spare moment, I'm sure that even listening to the podcast with the coach would be super interesting.
That's probably where I'll start.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So Drew, where do you see this being applied for me as a typical endurance runner who might have a training load of, I don't know, 8 hours a week or whatever, but trains for 1 to 2 bigger events of the year? How can your research be applied to someone like me, do you think?
That's a good question. I don't want to, I don't know. I'm a bit of, I don't want to say Luddite. That's not really the word. I am skeptical when it comes to trying to apply, cutting edge scientific ideas to athletic performance, if only because I think 90% of what it takes to be a successful endurance athlete, we already know what it is.
Yeah.
All right. It's train your ass off, it's eat enough calories and get enough salt and water.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, I think that's 95%. So the 5% is what everyone argues about and inflates it into being more like 50%. Like, you got to drink your beet juice or else you're not going to win a race. And it's like, that's bullshit.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the 5% that doesn't matter for most of us.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know that there's going to be a direct application of this for most athletes.
Yeah.
I think there will be applications of this for athletes who are training at the limits of energy expenditure, which honestly most of us aren't. I mean, because if you just do the math on what is roughly 2.5 times BMR, you know.
Yeah, let me think. If my BMR is like 1,700 calories, then that's
right.
Yeah, 3,400 plus another 850. Yeah, like 4,150.
Yeah. Right. And, there are certainly days that I'm sure that your total energy expenditure is 4,000 to 4,500 calories a day. But the insights from this research that will be applicable for athletes will be for people who are doing that every day on average.
Yeah, sure. Right? Yeah.
Because most of us will have days like that, and then we'll take a couple days where we're repaying that, energetic debt. Mm-hmm. But there are people who don't repay that debt, and they're always living right on that edge. And I think for those athletes, it will be like this Norwegian team is doing, actually having a sort of gold standard measurement of energy expenditure, which could be doubly labeled water, or even better, live in a metabolic chamber for a day. And then if you actually could track it, then that could be helpful for them. But for the rest of us, I think the utility of this won't be huge for most of us. It's more contributing to our understandings of evolved metabolic processes. And I'm a huge fan of learning stuff just for the sake of learning it. And it always, I don't know, even in my field, I'm a biological anthropologist. There's always this push for how can your research, be applied for human this or that, or, for the betterment of society. And I'm like, honestly, I don't usually care. Yeah. I went into science to get my mind blown all the time. There's, the universe is amazing and the human body is amazing. I just want to know where we came from. And everyone's like, well, how does this apply? I'm like, there are applications of everything, but that's not why I'm doing it.
Nah, and do you know what, Drew? I absolutely love that, because I'm like you. Like, there's nothing I like more. Actually, you didn't say this, but I love just spending an hour on PubMed with an idea in my head and then just saying, what do we know about this? For no other reason than just to inform a better understanding about a particular topic. So, and even just the ability to have conversations about it.
Yeah.
It's another hour spent talking about things that I'm interested in. So if really that's the application for me, I'm happy to leave it there.
I mean, I may have a very different answer in 2 years. I might be, hawking some product. Like, actually, we have developed this thing that I really think everyone should be subscribed. Maybe, and if, and then we're going to be erasing the words I just said here.
Yeah, which is no problem at all. So you've got a paper that's that is in progress for about to be published. When will that come out, Drew, do you think?
Oh, well, I have to make the edits to it. I would imagine it'll be out by summer.
That's awesome. And then if anyone just sort of does fall into the training parameters plus the geographical location of your study, how best would they contact you?
Oh, email, please. Well, I would say email, or you can find me on Twitter, also the Running Primate on Twitter. Email andrew.best@mcla. That's an M as in mom, mcla.edu. And if you live close enough that you can send frozen samples to North Carolina, USA, without them thawing, and you're training 20 plus hours a week in some kind of endurance sport, we are interested.
Amazing. Drew, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mikki. It's been fun.
Okay, so a little bit geeky, but not in a bad way. Hopefully you enjoyed that conversation, and absolutely, check out Andrew's Twitter, because I think that's where we'll find his most recent research when it's published, and we'll just be able to be kept up to date with what's going on in his space. Next week on the podcast, I speak to medical doctor Vivian Lowe, all about obesity and metabolic health, which is a fascinating conversation. Until then, you can catch me over on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website mikkiwilliden.com, where in addition to signing up to one of my meal plans, you can book a one-on-one call with me. All right, team, you guys have the best week. Talk soon.